This week on the THEOS Cybernova podcast.
You've upset a lot of very rich and powerful people. How safe do you feel?
These are the people that are calling up your mum and dad and mom and pops and screwing them over of their life savings. And that's a $1 billion business. There is a risk when you do that kind of work, because if you're the only one reporting it for a while, I think there's a risk when, maybe killing you would lead to that information not getting out. Bradley called me. It was 3 a.m. in Kuala Lumpur, and I took a taxi to the Singapore border. And I didn't go back to Malaysia for about 4 years after that. That keeps me awake at night, like that somebody could have set up a fake persona with a bunch of fake information.
And especially in the age of AI, right? Deepfake.
Yeah, to then make me report something that is totally fake. And then, that's terrible.
The THEOS Cybernova podcast, hosted by Paul Jackson.
Welcome to the THEOS Cybernova podcast with myself, Paul Jackson. Today, we're going to have a very special guest with us today. It's Tom Wright. Thank you for joining me, Tom.
Great to be here.
Yeah, so this will be a special 2-part podcast episode to close out season 2 in style. Tom, you're the co-author, together with Bradley Hope, of the acclaimed book, The $1 Billion Whale. Now, The $1 Billion Whale is an eye-popping account, really is, of one of the most brazen heists of all time. A best-selling book that I'm sure will be familiar to all of our listeners. What they may be less familiar, though, Tom, is your subsequent work in, as you term it, whale hunting, which I think is a great name. And I want to dive into that more in these episodes. And I guess, you're under this umbrella of Project Brazen, so I think that's a fitting name, isn't it? You obviously you chose that deliberately there. So let's start with, a little bit of background, because your work on the 1MDB scandal with the Wall Street Journal was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, if I'm right, in 2016. I mean, that must have been a great feeling, right?
Well, we didn't win it. We were only nominated. We were finalists. I was once in a sort of battle on Twitter with somebody in China, one of these apologists for the Chinese regime, and he pointed out, on your LinkedIn, you say you're a Pulitzer finalist, but you didn't win it. And I was like, yeah, that's true. But we got pretty close. I think we were beaten by the New York Times. But yeah, it was. It seems like a long time ago now. It was a decade ago when we uncovered the Jolo story. We weren't the ones who broke it. That was a Malaysian newspaper and a blogger. But I spent like a good 3 to 4 years of my life on that story, and started out with, who is this guy Jolo? Why has he got billions of dollars? What's his relationship with the Malaysian Prime Minister? And we unraveled it from there to sort of prove one of the biggest heists in history. Incredible story.
A truly incredible story. And, we met around a decade ago, just after I'd left JP Morgan. And I was so inspired by your dedication to get the facts. And as it turned out, it's a massive book and a lot of facts in it. Yeah,
it's like a 110,000 word book. So it really took a lot of work. I mean, honestly, it was very, very difficult to do because so my co-author Bradley Hope was also at the Wall Street Journal at the time. He had lived in the Middle East, and there was a huge Middle East component to this. I mean, for your listeners who don't know the story, basically, this guy Jolo was in his 20s. He got to know the Malaysian Prime Minister. The Malaysian Prime Minister said, okay, you run this sovereign wealth fund from behind the scenes. And they went ahead and stole billions of dollars and used it to make the film The Wolf of Wall Street with Leonardo DiCaprio, to date, Jolo, a pudgy Chinese guy in his 20s, ended up dating Miranda Kerr, the Australian supermodel. They threw hundreds of thousands of dollars at Jamie Foxx to play the piano for 5 minutes, that kind of stuff. So that's a story we unraveled. But of course, it had much more important implications as well, because Goldman Sachs was involved. They helped raise the money. One of their partners has gone to jail. Not for very long, but Tim Lyson, the partner, went to jail. The Prime Minister of Malaysia is in jail, which is an amazing thing. The system held in Malaysia, a very corrupt place, but the system held, and they were able to put the Prime Minister in jail, who'd given cover for all of this stuff to happen. And then, of course, lots of financial institutions were involved abetting this stuff, because so much money was sloshing around. People were making so much money, they allowed it to happen. So
yeah, the looking the other way was staggering, wasn't it, really? I guess when there's eye-watering sums like that, then, greed takes over a little bit, doesn't it?
Well, it's it's the old adage that if you or I want to move a few $1,000, we get a lot of compliance questions. But if you want to move $100 million, then there aren't so many compliance questions, because people's end of year bonuses are going to be very large.
Right. Well, it's a fascinating book. And, for those, listening to this who haven't read it already, I've read it twice now. Well, once I've read it and the other eyesight's getting a bit bad. So I I downloaded the Audible version, which is excellent as well. Great narration. So the purpose of this conversation is not really to rehash the whole book and the story. But so the audience, our audience may be thinking, well, why invite somebody like you to a cybersecurity and investigation focused podcast? And just to set the scene a little bit, perhaps, my background. Obviously, I've been an investigator for a few decades now, and what I try to do is in my work is try to avoid the silos of, you've got cyber forensics, cyber investigations, forensics, online intelligence. And then in another silo, you've got the guys who do traditional fraud, insider threat, financial investigations, etc., when really they need to be meshed and merged and, to get the greatest impact. So the work that you've done, though, as an investigative journalist has got many overlaps with my world in the cyber investigation work. And my intention here today is to explore these aspects further. But before we start, I'd like to sort of ask you a key question. I mean, you've upset a lot of very rich and powerful people. How safe do you feel?
Well, you're asking me this just before we came on, and I was saying, well, that's the question my wife asks me. Why did you have to piss off some rich and powerful people again? I mean, we don't set out to do it. It's like we're really driven by finding stories that people don't know. I don't want to cover the news that's already out there. The latest story, for example, that we did was about this South African guy called Benjamin Mauberger, who more or less took over the government of Thailand, bribing from the prime ministers all the way down. He was a money launderer for the scam centers in Cambodia. He's now on the run in Dubai.
Yes.
So we find stories like that, and often people come to us these days. We've been doing it a long time as well. We get a lot of tips. A lot of times, as you know, whistleblower tips are not great. You get people who got fired or something and they don't go anywhere. But sometimes, this story in particular, for example, we were tipped off a couple of years ago. Who is this South African guy who's buying, tens of millions of dollars worth of planes for Cambodians and then for Thaksin Shinawatra, the former prime minister of Thailand? And it turns out he was this huge money launderer for the scam centers. These are the people that are calling up your mum and dad and mom and pops and screwing them over of their life savings, and that's a $1 billion business. So there is a risk when you do that kind of work, because if you're the only one reporting it for a while, I think there's a risk when maybe killing you would lead to that information not getting out. But in general, one of our very strict rules is never threaten. I would never say to a target of an investigation, if you don't do X, I'll do Y, for example. So it's very much like, look, we learned this. We think this is really interesting. Do you have anything to say about it? And that's the way we approach things, I think. And if you do it that way, even people who, we did a podcast about a guy called Fat Leonard who had corrupted the US Navy. We smuggled a microphone to him in detention in San Diego. He basically ripped up his plea deal with the American government to do our podcast. But he still talks to me because, he doesn't see me as a threat. I never threatened him. I just gave him an outlet to talk about his experiences. And even though he was a criminal and had ripped off the US Navy, he still wanted to tell his story. So, sometimes very dangerous, but I think most of the time, if you operate in a truthful way and don't threaten, I think you can. Yeah.
Yep. Well, you're a very brave person, in my opinion. But we'll talk in part 2 of this podcast more about the scam centers, because obviously that's a hot topic for us. But in your book, you did recount a story where you were in the Shangri-La Hotel in Kuala Lumpur and you received a threatening call which made you dash for the border. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, that's a story where Bradley, the co-author of the book, was he got a call from someone who was pretending to be a friend. And he said, look, the Prime Minister of Malaysia knows that Tom's in the Shangri-La in Kuala Lumpur, and he's thinking of arresting him. So as a friend, I'm saying to you, he should probably not be there. But actually that person was part of the inner circle of what was going on and was threatening us by doing that. But we didn't know that at the time. We took it as a friendly hint. And so Bradley called me. It was 3 a.m. in Kuala Lumpur, and I took a taxi to the Singapore border. And I didn't go back to Malaysia for about 4 years after that.
Oh, wow.
Until Najib lost power in an election and then was subsequently jailed. So the Prime Minister was jailed, and Jolo ended up in China, which we can talk about if you're interested. But like the danger levels went down a lot at that point.
Right. So let's go to the backstory, because I always like to understand the backstory of our guests. And what really drove you to get into investigative journalism in the first place?
Well, as a kid growing up in England, I grew up in Birmingham in the UK.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, really? Where are you from?
Yorkshire.
Well, I haven't been to Birmingham for years, but I'm going to stand up for it. I think it's a great place. It's a great place to have a childhood. So, I was very interested in the film The Killing Fields. You know, obviously about the Khmer Rouge and the New York Times journalist who reported on it, and the Cambodians who were involved. And I did when I was probably in middle school, I did a project on it, and I always wanted to become a foreign correspondent. I ended up in Indonesia in the 90s. I actually lived in Indonesia between high school and university, learned Indonesian, lived in Bandung, and then went back and worked for Reuters at the end of the Suharto era. So when Megawati was coming up and Suharto, the dictator of 32 years, Suharto was falling. And I got a taste for the whole sort of running with very dangerously at that time, with no training, running with, between the protesters and live bullets and all that kind of stuff. And I did that. I got a job at the Wall Street Journal eventually, did AFPAC coverage, did Pakistan coverage. I was a Pakistan reporter for a while when Osama bin Laden was killed. And the first proper investigative story I did was about a company called Suzlon in India, which is a wind turbine company. Mm-hmm. And it was $1 billion company at one point, but they were sort of stealing their technology. And I sort of found out about it, and we ended up reporting to a degree where the share price totally collapsed. The company basically had to reset. So you get a sort of a bit of an adrenaline rush with that kind of reporting, because it's not something anyone else is doing. You have to pick why you're doing it. You don't do this stuff gratuitously. There's normally, in that case, India had this story of being a huge boom economy at the time, but it didn't have the sort of good governance practices in place. And so that was an interesting story to sort of to put out there at the time. There was a public reason to do it. The Journal was happy with me spending a lot of time on it. And so, I got more job satisfaction out of spending more weeks doing it than the sort of daily news or the sort of more press conference type of journalism.
Right. What made you leave the Wall Street Journal in the end then?
Oh, well, so then we ended up doing the $1 Billion Well book that you've referred to.
Yep.
That came out in 2018. And then the next year, at one point, the initial reason to quit was because the Journal wouldn't allow me to do public speaking. And when you have a best-selling book, for a while, you have quite a lucrative public speaking opportunities. So I did that for a while. Then COVID happened, and that killed that. So then I'm like, okay, well, no, do I go back to journalism? And then I managed to persuade Bradley, who was the co-author of the book, who was still at the Journal at the time, to leave. And we set up Project Brazen, which is actually named after it is brazen because we like the name, the word, but it's also because Jolo had the Malaysian fraudster had a shell company called Brazen Sky.
Right.
So we quite like the sort of link to what we're doing. So we set up the company, and the company's sort of modus operandi is to find true stories that are adaptable for TV and film. That's what our business model is. We try to produce Hollywood films that are based on true events.
Right. Again, switching gears slightly, I read a review by the Tribune Star of your book, which says details in the book can be a slog, but give the book authority. And got to be honest, they're not wrong, right? And there is an incredible amount of detail and research. So what I'm curious about is how you document all this, because in my prior life as a cop, and obviously as an internal corporate investigator, I needed to use tools like i2, Analyst Notebook, but I have visions of you, with a huge board covered in photos, documents, and bits of string, tying them together. So what's your secret, or do you just have a phenomenal memory?
No, I don't have. I'm not very well organized either, actually. But if I had my time again, and I think Bradley would agree with this, to do the book again, we'd probably put less detail in. The problem with a nonfiction book like that is, if you come at it as a journalist, you're like, oh, I'm writing a version of history here that we need to put everything in. But there's another half of you which is like, well, I'm trying to write an entertaining nonfiction book which draws people along. And so you actually get complaints from both sides. You get people saying, well, you haven't given enough of the financial background to explain the fraud. And then you get people who say, well, it's a slog. It was hard to get through these pages. So we had a rule of like short chapters, lots of scenes, trying to keep it as light as possible. But yeah, there's probably a little bit too much money trying to. In terms of how do we work, one way to write a book like this or to do any work like this is to keep a timeline. That's the first thing we would always do, is like develop a thousands of words timeline from person born, this, and color code it, different characters, different. that then gives you the narrative spine to then create like a chapter outline of like how you're going to tell the story. Because you probably don't want to tell it like purely chronologically. And then in terms of organizing, you would then have lots of files that are then related to the timeline. So, okay, this person is this color, this file is related to this person. Doing $1 Billion Whale in the age of AI would be a lot easier.
No, for sure.
Because back then, we would get, say, for example, somebody gave us an Excel spreadsheet of Jolo's BlackBerry messages. And you imagine like Jolo, the fraudster, is apart from being a fraudster, he's also just organizing where he's going for his, lunch or drinks or whatever. And he's like sharing restaurant recommendations with people. And you had to physically slog through all of that on the Excel spreadsheet to get to the bit where he goes, have you opened the Acme Time Limited shell company for me? And you go, then your brain goes, oh, I remember seeing that elsewhere in financial documents. So it was almost like that. It was very much not happenstance, but you had to remember salient names and things and then cross-reference them, right. Which I think could be done now with you could train a AI to look for that for you. So I don't have a phenomenal memory, but I do have a very good instinct for, okay, I've heard of that shell company somewhere else, and then remembering where that was and going and finding it, with always with a narrative in mind, because I needed to have a little narrative moment somewhere.
Right. It's a shame you didn't end up in law enforcement, because I think, your skills would have been very
I think
valuable.
they're similar, right?
Very similar. Oh, yeah. 100% so similar.
When you were in the Hong Kong police.
Yep, correct. It was, and again, AI would have definitely helped then. You're bombarded with facts and trying to, make the story straight is challenging, right? But I'm very disappointed you don't have a massive board with photos and.
No, it's not like those Netflix B movies where you go down into the basement and there's a thing. No, but I did have a whiteboard so I wrote, my part of the book. Bradley was in the US and London. I was in the Hong Kong University when I did it, and I did have a whiteboard with those kinds of things.
Right. So your book's sold well over 500,000 copies. I don't know what the latest number is. What is the latest number?
It's over 1 million, yeah.
Oh, over 1 million. Wow. Well done. And, obviously the MDB scandal has been widely reported in Wall Street Journal and other publications. But prior to this podcast, I actually asked a few of my friends, what they actually knew of the incident, what details, and very few could recall details other than it was a massive fraud. I was curious about this, and there's a bit of psychology, I think, in this. Do you think that these stories that you come up with, and we'll talk more about, your current investigations, do you think they're just so complex and the sums are so hard to fathom that people just fail to comprehend, perhaps, or is it just yet another sign of the shortening of attention spans in this day and age?
I think it's just a shortening of attention spans. I think there's so much content out there at the moment that to get someone to really know something, to actually read it, is hard. It's actually already a win. So, for example, this news story I've been writing about, which we'll get into later, about this South African fraudster who took over the Thai government. That's the elevator pitch for it. If anyone's even heard of his name, Benjamin Mauberger, can tell me that he took over the Thai government, that's already a win. Because your friends, you might send them the PDF of the 7,000 word story you wrote on it, but they're not going to read it, or some will read it. People like yourselves will read it for maybe professional reasons. You try to make it as sexy as possible. You play up the most Netflix, adaptable elements of any story to hook people. So we know how to do that. We know how to do, Twitter threads that try to hook people, or LinkedIn posts. But for someone to really engage with a story that's quite complex is difficult, right? And then, you look at the news flow. At the moment, it's 90%, what's going on in Minnesota, right? Very easy to grasp, ICE agent shot someone. And that those things sort of suck out all the air out of the room. So when you're working on other stuff, it better be like catnip for audiences, otherwise they're not going to engage with it. So.
Well, that's a real challenge, making something like the 1MDB scandal into bite-sized pieces, isn't it?
Well, that's why we originally wrote the book at 18 chapters, and our editor was like, "Well, you better do this like a James Patterson novel and make it 40 chapters." With each one being 3 pages, because then people feel like they're making progress, and you can cut the narrative. So you're seeing now there are these Chinese, I think they call them they're basically like vertical telenovelas on phones, where episodes are like 90 seconds or a couple of minutes, whatever. But over time, you can still tell a 3-hour story and do it in those bites. It's challenging, but I think that is the future of this kind of content. You need to keep things short, and then build up detail over a longer sort of time frame.
So let's talk a little bit about operational security, because in our world, this is a huge topic, especially when we're dealing with cyber threat intelligence. I've got a feeling it must be a critical part of the way you operate, because there's two parts to this: protecting your own anonymity sometimes when you're trying to get facts out without them knowing who you are, what your objectives might be. And secondly, obviously, you've got informants who have a very strong reason for staying anonymous, that you have to protect their identities. So can you talk a little bit about what you do in both those contexts?
Well, in the first context, I never will pretend to be someone I'm not. I just personally don't like that. I think the British press do it a bit. The American press don't really do that. James O'Keefe does that at Project Veritas, and I think it's terrible, right? Like, you pretend to be someone else and you got your people. And the reason for that is you're just sort of stooping to the level of other criminals, right? By pretending to be other people. There may be reasons why you might do that in an operational setting if you're a police or something. But if you're a journalist, I think it's much better to say, look, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing. And I think people trust you more then. Like, going back to you talking about safety as well, I think if you start to pretend you're someone you're not and trick people, your safety, your danger levels go up quite a lot as a journalist. Whereas if you say, look, I'm working on this story, this is what I found out, what's your response? Always give a right of response to people, so they can come back. I would do all of that out in the open, because I just think it's better for us. In terms of the protecting the source, that's totally different. You see a lot of discussion now on social media about whether you should give anonymity to sources, right? There's been a big debate this week about whether a hit piece, well, I shouldn't call it a hit piece. There's been a piece about Barry Weiss at CBS, her takeover of CBS, right, where it's been criticized by a lot of people in CBS who were all given the right to be off the record. And you could argue, well, that's not important enough. And if you're going to criticize another journalist about journalism, do it on the record, right? So I think I would agree with that. But if it's somebody who's deep inside a corrupt government, a country with no rule of law, who's giving you secrets at the risk to their own safety, then it's very important that you protect them. So in terms of operational security, I mean, we talk about that. If you like, how do you keep those people safe?
Yeah. Okay. So how do you protect their identities? Because you have to trust that you're really speaking to the right people. So you have to validate that part, and yet that validation probably comes in some form of communication or messaging that you have to protect them.
That's a very good question about how do you make sure you're not being... That keeps me awake at night, like that somebody could have set up a fake persona with a bunch of fake information.
And especially in the age of AI, right? Deepfake.
Yeah, to then make me report something that is totally fake. And then, that's terrible. Yes. So let's put it onto the meat of a real example. So this Benjamin Mauerberger story that, again, just to recap, South African guy laundered billions of dollars for the Chinese mafia networks in Cambodia, the ones that are doing the scam centers, calling Americans, getting them to invest in fake crypto. He's laundered a lot of the money. A lot of the money moved through Singapore, over $1 billion moved through the fund management structures in Singapore. He set up a fake fund management company here. So there are sources to this. You don't just report this because somebody gives you a document. You need human sources and documents. You need to triangulate it all, and can't get into very specific details because of source protection. But you need to ensure that the people who are talking to you really are who they say they are. So I would spend a lot of time doing that work, and you can do that social media. You can do it by talking to other people and just figuring out who they really are. And then when they give you things, you need to sort of triangulate that against other sources as well to make sure that they're not doctoring documents or they don't have an axe to grind. Yeah. But, in this particular case where we were, trying to prove the movement of hundreds of millions of dollars, we were able to find multiple ways to see that movement and then feel careful enough, safe enough that this was real. And then the sort of to answer your initial question, how do you protect those sources? Well, first of all, you don't put their name in the story. Yes, that's obvious. But then, what if I were to get hacked by somebody? Well, exactly. Yes. So I would keep my notes. But you have to have notes that you take when you talk to them, because if I were ever to get subpoenaed or have a defamation suit against me, I would need notes, right? Like, oh, I talked to this person. So you keep those, but I would keep those physically somewhere, right? Then I would have, then any documents they gave me, I would have without their name on it somewhere else. And so somebody couldn't hack my computer and go, okay, there's a name and there's an interview.
Do you worry about your phone, though? Because last week we had Bill Marksack on the show from the University of Toronto Citizens Lab, and they do great work, in terms of understanding the threats to mobile phones, hacking of journalists, especially those operating in areas where their life is a threat. We all know those places, right? Probably the most famous tool out there is Pegasus, which is basically a hidden tool which allows full access to your phone. Do you not worry about that, because obviously you're probably communicating with most of your contacts via your phone?
Yes, yeah. There's other safety protocols you can take, like using apps like Signal. Not having the person not use their real name on their user login. So be very careful that when I'm talking to a source who's I think taking a big risk, that they would be using some kind of pseudonym on their special account that they've set up on Signal or Telegram or something. So if you were to hack the phone, you wouldn't know who they were necessarily. So things like that. Is it foolproof? I don't know, but we do our best to ensure the safety of sources.
And talking about sources, you obviously had a number of sources from inside government bodies and financial institutions who are, dealing with their very sensitive information. How do you cultivate these sources, or do they all come to you?
Again, let's talk about the specific case of this story we've been working on. So the way that this story first came out was that this guy Benjamin Mauerberger was raising suspicions in Southeast Asia because he was operating on he was a boiler room operator from 20 years ago. So basically selling worthless stocks from, people might remember the Ben Affleck movie from 2000 called Boiler Room. Yes. Vin Diesel. It's a good movie. So he was selling these things for years, got on the radar of a bunch of authorities. And he had a Cambodian diplomatic passport because he wasn't able to travel to other places because he was wanted for the boiler room stuff. And then a few years ago, he suddenly starts buying Bombardier private jets and, for various people, for Cambodian rich kids. And then, as I said earlier, for Thailand's prime minister. So that's how he came onto our radar. That's how people often come onto our radar, is when they start spending a lot of money. That's how Jolo came onto people's radars. Back in, 2009, 2010, he was putting on he invented the bottle parade. The fraudster Jolo, when people come in with the sparklers and the champagne, and the ace of spades, whatever it is, he invented that basically in Saint-Tropez. So that's how he came onto people's radars at that time. So often the inability not to spend gargantuan sums of cash when you've stolen it is one way that we start to hear about people.
Interesting, yeah. No, that's all good. So, of course, talking about Jolo, right? Who obviously is the subject of the $1 billion whale. You recently exposed that he apparently traveled to China on a fake Australian passport. And also, as part of your whale hunting, you obviously have the hunt for Jolo. Is it a source of frustration to you that, he hasn't yet had to answer to the numerous allegations surrounding his involvement in the fraud?
A little bit, but honestly, I'm sure just like you, we're pretty hard-boiled by this point, hard-bitten. I don't know what the best way to describe us is, but I mean, justice is always partial, right? You're never going to have true justice, and I'm not naive about that. I think in the case of Jolo, the fact that the prime minister of the country who, gave him the cover to do what he did, the fact that he's in jail is like something I never would have imagined, right? And just recently got given a bunch more years. So
I saw that.
Yeah. So Najib, the former prime minister, is in jail. Jolo, we launched a sort of online search for Jolo last year. We bought up a bunch of meme coin. Someone had come up with the dollar Jolo meme coin, which was languishing, wasn't doing anything. So we just bought it all up and we offered it as a reward for people who had any tips, which is not something you'd be able to do at the Wall Street Journal. That wouldn't be. And it was, honestly, to be honest, it was a bit of a stunt because no one had made any money out of it. But we did end up getting some really good tips, including that Jolo was in China. He tried to check into a place with a fake Australian passport, but somebody had recognized that that was him because it was still the same photo. He was using this ridiculous name, Konstantinos Veres, which was, I think, a Cypriot sounding name because at some point he had to move money via Cyprus. I think that's why.
And he was wearing glasses in the photo.
Yeah, he was wearing glasses in the photo, which you're not allowed to do in an Australian passport photo, someone pointed out. So that was clearly fake. And, we found out where he was living in Shanghai and all of that. So he's, if anyone's listening and is interested in why a fraudster is living in China, it's because he was involved in a lot of corrupt Belt and Road infrastructure deals involving China after the 1MDB fraud. And so that's why he's given protection in China to continue living there, basically. He knows where the bodies are buried when it comes to Chinese corruption.
Right. So most of his assets, or all of his assets, I think, were sold off, right? The physical assets, that is. But towards the end of your book, you do note that he still had the boat. But I don't believe he's got that anymore. Right?
No. So what you're referring to is like the U.S. Department of Justice seized $1.5 billion of assets, I think, or actually might have been closer to $2 billion of assets. This is stuff like, this is a civil suit, not a criminal suit against him. Right. It was called the U.S. versus the Wolf of Wall Street because he actually went over after the proceeds of the film, that Jolo became great pals with Leonardo DiCaprio. He funded the Wolf of Wall Street. So they seized all those assets, mansions in L.A., hotels, his stake in EMI Music Publishing. He had all these businesses. And then the proceeds of that, a lot of that flowed back to Malaysia in a settlement. And then, of course, there were criminal actions against him too. So he's still wanted in Malaysia, in the US, and in Singapore for criminal indictments.
Right. Okay. Well, hopefully one day he'll have to answer to them. But in the meantime, I guess you've been probably sued by quite a few of the people or organizations that you mention in the book. How many is it to date?
We haven't been sued by anybody.
Oh, you haven't been sued by anybody?
It's very hard to sue someone if everything's correct, I mean, so no, we from Billion Dollar Whale, we did not receive a single defamation suit, which honestly I'm quite proud of because it's almost 400 pages of a nonfiction book. And it was, like I said earlier, it was very stressful because, every time you say something, it has to be backed up with documents and facts, right? The Mauerberger story we're doing now, we have had a lot more legal action.
Right, and we're going to come to that in part 2 of this podcast. But to close out this first episode with you, I've heard rumors that they may be making the Billion Dollar Whale into a movie or TV series. Any truth in that? Yeah.
So it's a movie.
Oh, it's going to be a movie.
Yeah, it's a movie. The script is fantastic. It's completed, and can't talk too much about the details of the package that's being put together. But the script is fantastic. It's written by a screenwriter who wrote War Dogs, which is the Jonah Hill movie and Miles Teller movie about guys who sell arms into Iraq, and it's a sort of like a dark comedy. So it's got that sort of dark comedy feel to it. The Billion Dollar Whale script that we have, and it's going to be a fantastic movie.
Do we know who's going to star as Jolo?
No casting secrets available yet, but it's going to be a great movie. It's just these things take about twice as long as you'd imagine they were going to take when you
I
first
could
said
only
about
imagine.
it.
Will you have involvement in
Yeah, so our business, Project Brazen, that we've built, which is a TV and film business, it came out of selling the rights to Billion Dollar Whale to another company, SK Global, who are our partners in many of the shows we're developing. SK Global famously did Crazy Rich Asians. They were the producers of that movie, if people remember that, from 2018.
Yes.
And we sort of started to learn about the Hollywood adaptation process from being journalists and writers. And that's why we set up Brazen, that does podcasts mainly, but we also still do books and long-form magazine articles. We have our own online magazine called The Foundry. And all of what we do is like amazing stories that we think would have adaptation potential.
Yes, well, I particularly like the whale hunting subdomain of your website. It's one that I look at regularly, and also your weekly newsletter, which I think Bradley puts out
on the weekend. Yeah, a roundup of other media.
Which is superb. And I do encourage anybody listening to go to, is it brazen.com?
If you want to subscribe to Whale Hunting, it's whalehunting.projectbrazen.com.
whalehunting.projectbrazen.com.
Yeah, and that's where sort of like we have an outlet for the journalism we still do. So when we're not producing TV shows and films, we still do our original journalism there.
Right. And of course, we encourage all our listeners to hit the like or subscribe button on this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be listening to. It really helps us to get the message out there with these important stories. And we obviously thank you for listening. And Tom, I really appreciate, your giving up time here in Singapore to have a chat with us. And I'm looking forward to the second session where we'll dig into some more of your investigation since the $1 billion whale was published. THEOS Cybernova was presented by myself, Paul Jackson. The studio engineer and editor was Manny Peñamora. The executive producer was myself and Ian Carlos. And this podcast is a co-production between THEOS Cyber and W4 Podcast Studio in Dubai.
The THEOS Cybernova podcast.